So I'm starting by making a grain pattern myself from scratch. You can find these kinds of things online too, but I'm just going to make a digital one here at about 4,000 pixels. And I'm going to start by making a background color that is a perfect 50% gray. I'm going to just hit Option Delete to fill that one. And this gives us our base color that when we overlay it, it shouldn't change the value of our footage at all. And then I will add noise. It'll be Gaussian noise and monochromatic. And maybe that presented just fine. Let's take a quick look. So this is creating a sea of admittedly digital noise. If we look at some analog noise to see what the difference is, and this has obviously got some other artifacts to it too. You can see it's not too far off. You could certainly use a piece like this. My fear is that when we repeat it, we're going to start to see some of these sort of thumbprints repeating. So we'll give that a try. Also, you'll notice that one looks a little brighter. So as we add it to the footage, there's the potential that it's going to brighten our footage, because we're going to use an overlay, and anything over 50% gray is going to brighten it. So I'm going to call this grain 4K Eagle. So that's what I am, and JPEG's fine. Now, obviously, just laying this on top wouldn't be enough. It would. It's going to need to animate too. So let's bring in. I'm going to bring in the one I just made, and we've already got those other guys in here. So this is just a shot on digital. Let's just work on getting the overlay first. So you'll notice that by making it 4,000 pixels, even if I was at 2K or something, I'd still have plenty of overlap. The idea is that we're going to pick it up and move it around. We're going to jiggle it over time so that we don't see the pattern repeat. We don't see things like this little sort of ski hill here in the same place every time. So for this, we're going to bring up the keyframes for position on this guy, and we'll option click on here, wrong finger again, to bring up the expression tools. The expression we'll put in for it is wiggle, and let's move it 400 pixels. That's going to be plenty so we don't see any repeat. Depending on the size of yours, that might be too much or too little, but 4K on my 1920 by 1080 should be okay. And then I'm going to move it 24 frames per second. And that will mimic, I'm going to hit function return or enter on the keyboard here, and we will see that as we advance it, that it's changing position on every frame. So we're going to add a position expression here. I'm going to hit the letter P while I have that layer selected, which brings up the position parameter, and then I will option click on the actual stopwatch itself to be able to type in the expression field wiggle, parentheses, and the number of times per second we want it to move, and the number of pixels across which we want it to travel on the X and Y axis. And you can hit enter, or if you don't have enter on your you don't have an extended keyboard on your laptop, you can hit function return. If you hit return, it's just adding a new line to the expression. But we can see that every frame it's bouncing 1,000 pixels. And if we were to look at that frame at a time, we can see the anchor point of it floating around, but if we view it in real time, it's looking a lot like noise. Now, obviously, we can't see through to that, so we'll switch to an overlay mode of overlay, which should give us, look closely here, that sizzle of film. And if that's too much, which it may be, it's where we can start to dial it back a bit to get it to be more of a smooth grain stock, for example, in there. Let's just bring it to life as if it were scanned film. Okay, so let's say that gets us, I'm going to go with something like 70. That gets us a modern image that's okay, right? But let's say we want to start to antique that up a bit. I wonder what happens if we switch it out with one of these ugly guys here. If you ever want to change what file is sitting here, but you want to keep all of the parameters, including my scale, my opacity, my expression there for position, I can drag a new one down, provided this one is highlighted, drag it down while holding Alt Option, and it'll switch it out, but keep the percentage. So that's actually kind of nice. Obviously, it's hopping off of the image there, so I need to go slightly less on the expression there. Let's see if that keeps it centered. Yeah. So I'm just skimming through and making sure it's not moving off of it, but because that's got some value variation, that's all very weird looking now. Because it's so drastically different across that frame, it's looking like every frame has a different exposure. So I want to go ahead and say I don't like that and switch back to my even version. Let's add our exposure variation as an expression on the footage itself. So if we're going for an antique look, we can obviously do something like color correct, hue saturation, or tint as a way to get the color out of that. And if we ever wanted to, off color it, we can either raise the grays or start to color them up. But I'm going to leave it black. Let's see what happens if we introduce a little chroma there, just a teeny bit. So now it's more washed out because of that tint, right? And let's add to an expression on another color correction. We'll do exposure. And this will be on the actual exposure control itself. I will again do a wiggle. Make sure that we're highlighted, wiggle. And how many times per second? Let's go 1 time per second. And what is our value? Let's start with 0.2 and see if that's too much. So return, enter. Okay, it's too small, I'm not seeing it. Let's go with 1. And again, I'm hitting control return, function return. Yeah, that's got some value change there. Okay, so 1 time per second is starting to look like somebody's manually doing it. We want it to look like the person is hand cranking it wrong. So let's crank that up to 8 times per second. That's a little too much. Let's try 3. And again, the value I think is too much. Let's go 0.7. And we're just kind of feeling it out until we see something that looks sort of antique-y. Bring this down to auto here. I want to be able to preview it in real time to know whether you got it, but that looks like a pretty good exposure change there, so that's pretty neat. The only other thing you might add to it to make it feel like a film transfer is this is because digital is locked perfectly down, and film transfers have a little bit of vertical, and usually vertical only, but sometimes horizontal wiggle on it too. So let's do this. We're going to scale it up by 5%, so 105. We'll go to position, and again, option click on here. We'll put in a wiggle here. That gives us a wiggle of every 4 times a second. It is wiggling 10 pixels. Let's see what that looks like. Just a little. Okay, so that's a pretty good wiggle. Let's crank it up a bit. That's a little too much. So I like the frequency, but I don't like the distance it's traveling. We'll do 5. Yeah, that's starting to look antique-y there. Other things that happen when you transfer footage. I'm making a new solid here. That's Command Y. I'm just going to come up with a vignette of sorts, just a little thing to cover it up. I like to then choose the rounded rectangle mask tool and come in here. And if you hold down the up arrow key, you can soften the corners of that. So I'm just trying to make kind of a TV shaped hole here. Obviously 16 by 9, that's sort of wrong, but subtract. And then we'll take that mask and we'll also F for feather and feather that out pretty substantially. Now at the moment it just looks like a fog, so we don't want that. We want to use something like a multiply on top there. Okay, so that's starting to come together. And if you want it to feel even more antique-y, guess what we can do? Let's wiggle this. Wiggle 4 times per second, 50 pixels. Let's try something like that. So again, it's whatever the first number is time. There we go. And then the second number is the number of pixels, or the value. So pixels of movement in the case of the wiggle, and then in the case of the feather there, how much feather. So it kind of comes in and goes out a little bit, pulsing. I'm of the mind, too, that you could conceivably paint damage on rather than, you know, if you can find or buy, usually, buy footage that has, that has damage already done to it, that's obviously ideal. Tell you what, that's the wrong value. I want to make sure I'm at 50% for this guy. It's a little bit brighter. And I'll label that so that I know. Yeah, so that gray will not add anything when we say overlay, but it does allow us to put film damage on it. Paint on a layer, we double click on it, which opens it in the layer mode. Our brushes, we get to choose a brush size, and then the paint tab here, it's not expanding all the way, so I'm going to just tear it off and dock it over here so we can see it. And I have to pull it down to expand all of the settings here. Paint color, what channels it's writing in, RGB is fine. And then here's where we're going to change it between writing on something that lasts the whole shot, or writing on something that appears over time, or in this case, we're going to paint a frame at a time. And we're going to make kind of a loop of damage. So I'm just putting some black specks on, and I'll advance a frame. That's a command and right arrow there to advance a frame. I'm just going to do a couple of little speckles. Obviously, humankind, we're not able to randomize perfectly, so you probably see that even if I'm trying, I'm not completely random. And some frames are more damaged than others. By the way, a little hair is okay. We can do gouges like that. Okay, so let's say we got 10, 12 frames of good stuff here. We'll be able to repeat that. Okay, that's a hairy one. All right, and if we advance that, you can see the speckles go on. So that would be dirt on the print. If you switch to white, you can do dirt on the negative, which might be something you want to. So let's put a couple of those on. Trying not to be too repeaty, if possible. Okay. All right. So the end result here is that we'll go and making sure that that layer is set to overlay. Now we've got a little razzmatazz filth on there. It's very sharp. Technically, maybe sharper than it should be, but a speck of dust, just a dot, a couple of pixels in width. So that 3 pixel on my HD size is probably good. So now I've got a 12 frame animation here, and it's going to run out. It's going to be as if the leader of that is more damaged than the rest of it. Okay, since a solid has no frames, we can't time remap, which is something we're going to do to make this thing loop. So we got to cheat it by turning it into a composition. A right click here, pre-compose, and we'll leave all attributes here. So there's our grain, but now it's sort of sitting in its own little nested comp. So we can go to layer, time, and enable time remapping. Time remapping gives us a keyframe at the beginning and a keyframe at the end, but the only area of interest here for us is the frames 1 through 12. So I'm going to put in a keyframe here and get rid of keyframe at the end. Now I'm going to put in an expression here, and it's too long an expression to remember, so go to this little triangle here. You could remember it, but I don't. And we'll go to property, loop out duration. That's going to keep, again with a function return, it's going to keep that whole section of noise guy didn't. Did it? I had it work once. All right. Since a solid has no frames in it per se, it is not allowing us to do what is called time remapping, which is part of the process to make this loop. So for this, we're going to need to pre-compose it. A little right click here, pre-compose, and we'll move all attributes into the new composition, which makes it look solid for now. And now we will be able to go to layer, time remapping. Okay, so we think 12 is our last frame of goodness here. So I'm going to put in a keyframe there. I'm going to ditch this final keyframe because we're going to loop out, and our out is currently set to the end. This is sort of trimming that layer. So now it's just kind of holding it, which is one way to do it. But we want an expression here. Easiest way to get this expression is to click on the little triangle and go to Property, Loop Out Duration, and then hit your function return. And that should keep our animation going through to the end. So hopefully people aren't counting frames and seeing that noise pattern repeat. But if we set this to now overlay, we'll get all of our hairy. Yeah, at 12 frames per second, or 12 frames total, that is a pretty distinctive loop. So if you double or triple the length of that, it's going to be something that people won't see, that sort of digital, oh, wait a second, it's repeating the same piece over and over again. But now, it looks like it's a piece of film from the 1920s, give or take.